I watched my husband perform as Alexander Hamilton in the Chicago production of Hamilton dozens of times, each night singing about the unimaginable loss of a child. And then that loss became our reality when our nearly 4-year-old daughter Adelaide passed away from a neurodegenerative disorder. The day she died, I went from being an attentive caregiver to a walking grief zombie, unaware of the time of day. So when people told me that they couldn't imagine losing a child, or that while they had experienced insert terrible loss here, it was nothing compared to what I was going through, I believed them. It wasn't until several weeks later, when I was once again sitting in the theater, that I began to question those once validating sentiments. There's a song in Hamilton called "It's Quiet Uptown." Now, it has been several hundred years, so I feel like it's okay to say this now, but spoiler alert, Hamilton's son Philip dies. In this song, Hamilton's sister-in-law Angelica sings about how the Hamiltons are going through the unimaginable following Philip's death. Now, I had heard that song hundreds of times before at my desk, in my car, at that very theater. But for the first time, those words no longer sat right with me. When we deem certain losses as unimaginable, we are bestowing upon them a superlative of sorts. We are saying that this loss is so terrible, we don't want to even think about it. The worst of the worst. Now, I am a highly competitive person. Give me all of the trophies and accolades, please, and thank you. But looking around the theater that day, that freshly awarded gold medal in grief was hanging heavy around my neck, and I felt lonelier than ever. Welcome to the Grief Olympics. Our participation in these games begins when we start to compare and rank our loss against others. Now, don't go beating yourself up. This is a completely natural reaction. In a 2014 scientific journal article in Neuro Report, it was noted that human judgment is by nature comparative and is largely responsible for human survival. Of course, our survival also used to depend on our ability to compare our size and strength with that of our prey so we could determine if we were bringing it home for dinner. Thankfully, we've come a long way since then. So now we know how these games came to be. Why do they matter? Remember when I was saying how quick people were to crown me the winner? Well, in doing so, several things were happening. First, by voting my grief to the top rung, they were in turn downgrading their own. These were people who had lost someone incredibly special and meaningful in their lives. Why were they so quick to say that my loss was worse? If they thought that it would make me feel better, then they need to know that there are no words in existence that can diminish someone's loss. But also, by taking a lower place on the podium, they weren't going to lessen their own grief either. Regardless of where we feel our loss ranks in the larger world of grief, we are still going to feel that experience to the same extent. The difference is that in one scenario, our grief is served with a side of shame and perceived self-weakness. The other is served without contempt or judgment. But there is another problem with awarding someone else grief gold, which can best be described through social comparison theory. Developed by Leon Festinger in the 1950s, he described this as upward social comparison. Now, in certain situations, this could be inspiring, motivating even. For example, a TED Talk. However, more often than not, upward social comparison can lead to negative self-esteem. Hello, social media. There is another less considered side effect of these comparisons, though, one which I experienced acutely. When we consider certain losses as unimaginable or the worst, we are granting society permission to avoid meaningful engagement on these topics. So when my daughter would come up in conversation, I could feel people grow uneasy, eager to change the topic. I now walked around in a fearful anxiety of Adelaide coming up in conversation. Not because I didn't want to talk about her, but because I didn't want to make anyone else feel uncomfortable. It was my then 8-year-old son who opened my eyes to this phenomenon. In a particularly poor parenting moment, I was pressuring him to watch a Godzilla movie. Now, in my defense, it was the pandemic, and I am fairly certain we had watched everything else age appropriate. Buddy, why don't you want to watch the movie? You know the monsters aren't real. It's not the monsters I'm scared of, Mommy. It's people's reactions to them. Huh. So clearly my child is an emotional genius, but also, yes, I wanted to talk about Adelaide. It was everyone else's fear and aversion of these topics that was causing me more pain and anxiety, not less. Society's aversion to discuss or have anything to do with supposed gold medal grief was clearly exemplified when I was trying to find a publishing house for my prescriptive grief book, Normal Broken. One would-be editor told my agent that while she really enjoyed my writing, she wished I had lost a husband instead, because that would be more marketable. If I had won these grief games, I certainly wasn't receiving the corresponding hardware or endorsements. But there is another side to this story. What happens when we crown ourselves the winner? This occurs when we decide that our loss is worse than anyone else's. The most common example is when someone shares their grief story and another person feels the need to one-up them. Regardless of what someone has lost, it is never the right move to try and diminish someone else's grief. Beyond the callousness, when we cling to that gold medal around our neck, it can begin to weigh us down and feel as if we have permission to stay stuck in our grief because our loss is just too much, too hard, too painful. To be clear, grief is hard and it is painful, but there is always a path forward. Healing is gritty and messy work, and there is also no finish line, much to my dismay. And as Nora McInerney wrote in her TED Talk, we don't move on from our grief. We move forward with it. Contrary to popular belief, moving forward doesn't mean letting go. It does, however, require us to let go of that gold medal. Like Gollum's gold ring, if we consider our grief one of the most special things about us, it will consume us. It cannot become our most precious. My daughter, my loss, my grief are not the most special things about me. I love my daughter immensely, but I was a whole person before her, and I have continued to be a whole person, albeit with a few more cracks since she died. I would experience firsthand just how difficult it can be for some people to let go of that gold medal when I was asked to speak at a grieving parents retreat several years ago. The retreat leaders informed me that they were concerned that there were some people in attendance who were stuck in their grief. They were going through the motions of life, but they were clinging to their grief for comfort. A world of grief had become their new normal, and they were resisting any forward momentum many, many years after their loss. The retreat leaders hoped that perhaps my talk might reach them. On stage, I shared my grief story, and I encouraged everyone about the importance of choosing to heal. One of the ways that we can do this is by talking about our loss and listening to others. Researchers James Pennebaker and Joshua Smith found that when we share our thoughts, feelings, and emotions verbally or through writing, we move them from one part of the brain to another where they can be processed. Another bonus of sharing what's going on, our thoughts, feelings, and emotions, is that we learn we're just not that special. Now, we are still special in all of the ways that PBS's Mr. Rogers taught us all of those years ago. However, while our grief story is unique to us, the way it makes us feel, our emotions, those are not unique to us. The more that we talk, the more that we share, we can begin to take those first steps forward with our grief together. I would discover several months later that there had been a few people in attendance who had been offended by my talk. They thought that by me saying that they just weren't that special, that I was trying to diminish their loss. I felt terrible. That had never been my intention. And then I remembered what the retreat leaders had said, that there were a few people in attendance who were stuck in their grief. And I began to wonder if perhaps those people were more caught up with their gold medals than they were concerned about my words. So, if those we are crowning and those who are self-crowning are not the victors, who the heck is winning these grief games? I would argue that no one wins. However, anyone showing up with compassion deserves an honorable mention. A few things to keep in mind the next time you're feeling that urge to compare or compete. Mark Twain wrote that nothing that grieves us can be called little. By the eternal laws of proportion, a child's loss of a doll and a king's loss of a crown are events of the same size. Basically, loss is loss is loss. We cannot compare grief because we are not comparing apples to apples. Two siblings who lose the same parent are not going to experience that loss the same way. I know for a fact that my husband Miguel and I did not experience our loss the same way. My grief would erupt from within me with zero concern for time, place, or company, whereas my husband's found him in more quiet moments of solitude. We lost the same child, but to the casual observer, my grief was more visible, more raw. Does that make my loss worse than my husband's? I don't think so. I think it means that we grieve differently, and that's normal. Now, I want you to imagine that someone is sharing with you one of the most shattering grief experiences of their life. And then you come to find out that what they lost was a piece of sports equipment. Perhaps you roll your eyes, or stare at them in disbelief, or chuckle quietly to yourself. Now I want you to imagine that that person was stranded on a deserted island following a plane crash, and a volleyball washes up on shore. They decorate it to look like a human and name it Wilson. And then one fateful day, that volleyball is swept out to the sea, lost forever. Yes, I am talking about the Tom Hanks movie Castaway. But I dare you to watch that movie and not feel something during that scene. All he lost was a volleyball. Yet it is still a gut-wrenching loss to witness. Loss is loss is loss. With compassion in mind, what even is the goal of comparing our losses? Or more to my point, to what extent? My husband and I were attending an event several years ago, and he began talking with a father who had also lost a child. Now, this father's child had been a young adult, and he had lived an otherwise healthy and typical life. Miguel told that father that he couldn't imagine losing a child that he knew so well. To which that father responded that he couldn't imagine losing a child that he never got to know. Loss is loss is loss. So the next time you're feeling that urge to compare or compete, try swapping it out with compassion. By bearing witness to someone's loss with an, "I'm so sorry. That sucks. Tell me about them." You will make a griever feel more seen than a ticker tape parade or gold medal ever could. By showing up, being present, and honoring what we've lost together, we can carry our grief forward with us, and we can heal, because no one can win when the contest is loss. Thank you.